Okay, hello everyone. So this lecture is about phylogenies and evolutionary relationships. So this is our first lesson, which will cover the learning guides 1.1 to 1.4. Right, to introduce you to evolution. Can you guess what is this organism? This organism looks like a snake, di ba? Sa itsura niya, it looks like a snake. But it's actually uh, Ophisaurus ventralis, which is a legless lizard, also known as the eastern glass lizard. Now, okay, some might ask, why isn't that glass lizard considered a snake? And how do biologists distinguish and categorize millions of species on Earth? So going back to the organism, which is the Ophisaurus ventralis, which is a eastern glass lizard. So another characteristic of this organism, aside from without legs, it doesn't have a highly mobile jaw. Okay. Also, it has larger number of vertebrae than the common snake, and it has a short tail located behind the anus. Now, working on the phylogeny of this Ophisaurus ventralis, ito yung position niya in phylogenetic tree. So in phylogenetic tree, as you can see, there is an ancestral lizard which give rise to different kinds of species like geckos, snake, iguanas, monitor lizard, and eastern glass lizard. As you can see in this group, there are two organisms that doesn't have legs, the snakes and the eastern glass lizard. But as you can see from these purple lines here, the loss of limbs happen in two different occasions. So, hindi sila nangyari, hindi dahil pareho silang walang legs, magkamag-anak na sila. Yung pagkawala ng kanilang legs ay nangyari at different or independent events. So, as you can see here, snakes is closely related to geckos than the eastern glass lizard. And the eastern glass lizard is more closely related to monitor lizard or ng mga bayawa. Okay, so this kind of tree is what we call phylogeny. So, ng phylogeny is evolutionary history of organisms. So, as you can see here, no, this phylogenetic tree tells us a history. So, ang history that geckos dito sa group na to is the more likely mas kamukha nung ating ancestral lizard, and then it gave rise to snake. And then the group of iguanas and the monitor lizard with the eastern glass lizard. Okay? Okay, let's start with the lesson 1.1. In lesson 1.1, it is entitled Overview of Phylogeny. Alright, so in your learning guide, you can see this illustration. This illustration is a controversial embryo drawing by Ernest Haeckel. As you can see here, in the earliest stage of development of different species of organism, they almost resemble each other. Notice at the first stage, all of them have tails, and same with gills, okay, and other parts also. But later, some organisms retain it, like this organism, but some lost it during the development. Using this illustration, Haeckel proposed that over the course of time, evolution added new stages to produce new life form. Thus, he proposed that embryonic development is actually a record of evolutionary history. Of course, this was proven not true eventually, but his theory became an initiator of some modern ideas. Okay, for this module, for this lesson, you have to remember 4 different terms. Number 1 is phylogeny, and then ontogeny, laws of developments, and phylogenetics. Okay, for the first term, we will introduce you to phylogeny. I already introduced this term earlier in the evolutionary history and classification of the eastern glass lizard. But just to reiterate the term, phylogeny is a hypothetical evolutionary relationship, or it's an illustration of hypothetical evolutionary relationship among different species. Also, phylogeny can tell us about morphological and molecular changes that occur in species lineage. It can also tell us about the sequence of descent from an ancestor. For example, this illustration is a tree of life, meaning it summarizes different species on Earth. Okay, as we can see here, there is a root. This represents the common ancestor that diverge into three domains. So as we can see here, for the sequence of descent, the bacterium diverged first from the root, and then archaea followed later by the eukaryote group. Okay? Next term is about ontogeny. And in this lesson, we will be studying the ontogeny and its relationship to phylogeny. When we say ontogeny, ontogeny is the study of development of embryo. Remember from the illustration of Haeckel, it's the development of embryo, so that is ontogeny. Notice in this picture, you will observe similarities in the chick embryo and the human embryo, just like the first illustration that I've shown to you. Okay, we can see here that at this stage of the development of the organism, they both have gill slits or the gills and the tail. This observation will give you an idea that chicks and human might share a common ancestor with fish because they also have tail and the gills. Thus, by studying ontogenic similarities of organisms, scientists can learn about evolutionary history of that particular organism. Okay, next is about different ideas related to phylogeny and ontogeny. We have two laws that was stated in your learning guide. We have the biogenic law and the Bond-Byers law. Alright, first theory is, let us go back to the theory that was proposed by Ernest Haeckel, that was previously introduced to you. This is also known as the biogenic law, or ontogeny recapitulate phylogeny. In this theory, he suggested that the development of embryo of an animal goes through stages resembling or representing successive adult stages in the evolution of the animal's ancestor. For example, in this illustration, in the course of the chick development, it should go through the following stages. A single-celled organism, maybe this is about the zygote, and then it will look like this, and it will look like a fish, and it will look like an amphibia, and it will look like an ancient bird before it will develop into a modern chick. Of course, this cannot be true. Ontogeny only gives us an idea of the ancestry because of the morphological similarities that they may share with their ancestor, and not similar or it will not represent the adult stage of its ancestor. The second law of development is called the Bond-Byers law, which was proposed by Carl Ernest von Baer in 1828. It is more accepted until today. Okay, it has 4 parts. Number 1, the more general characters of a large group appear earlier in the embryo than the more special characters. Meaning, we will observe general features of the organism first in the development, like the heart, the brain, etc., than the special characters like the hair and fingers. Okay? Number 2, from the most general forms, the less general are developed and so on until the most special arises. So, meaning, ang ibig sabihin nito, number 2, yung embryo, they develop from a uniform and non-complex structure into an increasingly complicated and diverse organism. For example, the defining character of vertebrates is the presence of the vertebral column. So, obviously, you will observe the development of the vertebral column earlier in the development of the embryo, followed by other characters that defines the organism, the special groups in the vertebrate. For example, the presence of fur in mammals, the scales in reptiles, and other forms that distinguish a group of organisms later in the developmental stage of the organism. Okay? Number 3, every embryo of a given animal form, instead of passing through the other forms, rather becomes separated from them. So this means animals from different species start out similar and become dissimilar from one another as ontogeny proceeds, or as the development of the embryo proceeds. As an example, the embryo of the fish, the human, and chicks, which all look similar to each other in the earlier stage of their development. But as they grow old or develop more, they look increasingly different from each other. The embryo of one species never resembled the adult of the other species. Instead of recapitulating the adult form that was proposed by Haeckel, von Baer theorized that the animal embryo diverged from one or few shared embryonic forms. So you can just see the relationship from the embryonic form, but not the adult stages of each organism. Okay? The fourth and lastly, the embryo of higher form never resemble any form, but only its embryo. This law states that the stages of development in more complex animals never represent the adult stages of less complicated animals. They resemble only the embryos of less complex animals. So makikita nyo dito, no? Magre-resemble lang sila sa embryo, but it doesn't represent the adult stage of the organism. Okay? To review and to compare and contrast Haeckel's law from von Bayer's law. So we have these illustrations. So Haeckel's law states that the stages of a complex organism recapitulate or resemble the adult stages of its ancestor. For example, the bird is related to frog, and fish. That's why in its developmental stages, it looked like a fish, and then it looked like a frog before it became a bird. Ganun din sa frog, that some of its development, or a part of its development, look like a fish, which is actually not true. Now let's go to von Bayer's law. The von Bayer's law, of course, von Bayer recognized the similarities of the development of the embryo, but he said that only the embryonic stages resemble each other, not the adult form. You can get some idea on the evolutionary stages of the organism, but it doesn't represent or recapitulate or resemble the adult form of its ancestors. Okay? Next is phylogenetics. When we say phylogenetics, is hypothesis about relationship that are represented by 3 diagrams. So we call this phylogenetic systematics. So when we classify organism based on their evolutionary relationship represented by phylogenetic trees. Okay? In this lesson, we are to discuss different types of trees that are used to depict relationships. We have the phonetics and we have the phylogenetics. Phonetic deals with the physical attributes of the organisms, and the phylogenetic deals with the evolutionary relationships. For phonetics, it produces a phylogenetic tree that we call phenograms. And there are 2 types of phenograms, the artificial and natural. When we say artificial phenograms, these are trees that is based from only few easily observable characters. And this is used, or this being made, for a limited purpose only, where convenience and speed are very important. And for the natural phenograms, these natural phenograms are derived from large number of characters and character states. For phylogenetics, we have 2 types of tree. We have the cladograms and the phylograms, which is, meron tayong dalawang branches. We have the cladistic and the phyletics, or phyletics. For the cladograms and the phylograms, almost similar ang kanilang appearance. But in the cladograms, it only shows us the branchings. Ano nung itsura ng branching, sino unang nag-diverge, sino nung later nag-diverge from the common ancestor. But the branch length doesn't mean anything. Unlike the phylogram, the branch length tells us something. It can be substitution rate or the number of characters different from the common ancestor or the time from the divergence from the last common ancestor. Okay? To illustrate the difference of phonetics and phylogenetics, particularly cladistics, we will create a phylogram and cladogram from these inanimate objects. So we have here rivet, nail, screw, and bolt. And we will describe them using character and character states. What is character and character states? When we say character, it is a well-defined feature in a taxonomic unit. For example, the organism, the species. And in this example, we have the nails, the rivet, the bolt, and the screw that can assume one out of two or more mutually exclusive character states. For example, a character can be height, weight, or color. For the character state, height can be tall or short. Character state of weight can be 2.7 kilograms, can be 1 kilogram, and so on and so forth. And then color, the character states can be red, blue, green, and other color. Okay, so going back to the definition, it can assume one out of two or more mutually exclusive character states. Meaning, if David is tall, David cannot be short. Right? Okay, going back. So we have here the nail, the rivet, the screw, and the bolt. So we have 7 characters, and our character trait is present or absent. Okay, for example, sa rivet, it doesn't have head notch. Okay, it doesn't have head notch. Doesn't have rounded head. Okay, not rounded head because it's flat. Doesn't have hex head. Doesn't have threaded shaft, tapered shaft, pointed tip, and it's not thick in diameter. Now let's go to the nail. Among the character, only the present is the pointed tip. For the screw, all are present except for the hex head. Of course, it has rounded head. And for the bolt, it doesn't have head notch. Okay, it doesn't have the notch here for the screwdriver. And then flat head, hindi siya rounded. And then hex head siya. Threaded ang kanyang shaft. No tapered shaft. No tapered shaft, hindi siya tapered. Hindi rin pointed ang kanyang tip. And thick in diameter compared to the other inanimate objects. Okay? Okay, using the character table, we can make 2 types of comparison. We can have a phonetic and cladistic comparison. In phonetic comparison, we will identify similarities whether the character is present or absent. We call these shared states. For cladistic comparison, we are only looking at the character state that are present. So we don't count the absent state. We call these characters derived states. So if we compare the nail in rivet for phonetic comparison, they shared 6 states, which are the absence of 6 characters. Okay, for screw and rivet, they shared 1 character or shared state, which is the absence of so the screw and the nail. So screw and the rivet, which is the absence of the hex head. Okay. For the screw and the nail, they share 2 states, which is the absence of the hex head and the presence of pointed tip. So as you can see here, we are counting the absence or the presence as soon as they share the state. Okay? Now for cladistic comparison, we are only looking at the present. So as you can see here, no, we scored all zeros for the comparison of rivet because rivet doesn't have any positive or any one score here. Okay, for screw and bolt, for screw and nail. For screw and nail, we scored it as 1 because they shared one character, which is the pointed tip. For bolt and screw, we scored this as 2 because they shared 2 as a character state, present character state, which are the peak diameter and the threaded shaft. Okay, using the comparison tables, it will give us two distinct trees, a phenogram and a cladogram. The phenogram will tell us that the rivet and the nail are most closely related or similar to each other than it is to bolt. And screw is the least similar among the three. But in cladogram, it can give us an idea that among the 4 items here, rivet is the most basic because it has the basic structure. Then the nail derived some characters that made it unique than the rivet. And then bolt and screw, as they are closely related to each other, might have derived more characters from a nail-like ancestor. Right? So it tells us the changes that happen from the rivet to the nail to screw and to bolt. This question is in your formative assessment 1. So it says cytochrome C is a mitochondrial protein which functions as an electron carrier in the electron transport system and plays an essential role in cellular oxidation. Which system of species classification entry is best used when using the changes in cytochrome C in delineating prokaryotic and eukaryotic taxa? So based from what we discussed from the 4 inanimate objects, you can derive the answer here, and you can justify your answer in our formative assessment 1. Okay.